Jeremy Steele, a professional landscape designer with years of experience behind him, had finally found the perfect place to call home. After years of working tirelessly on high-profile projects for wealthy clients across the country, he was ready to settle down in a quiet suburban neighborhood and create something personal, something he could truly call his own. He had bought a charming but slightly run-down house at the edge of the town. What had caught his attention wasn't the house itself, but the massive garden that surrounded it. Overgrown with weeds and wild shrubs, it had been neglected for years, but Jeremy saw potential where others saw disrepair. To him, it was a blank canvas, waiting to be transformed into a masterpiece. From the day he moved in, Jeremy devoted himself entirely to the garden. Every spare moment was spent digging, planting, and meticulously planning every detail. He brought in rare plants he had collected over the years, species from across the country that were difficult to find and even harder to grow. He built flower beds, set up a small but elegant pond, and installed a custom irrigation system to ensure everything thrived. By the end of 3 months, the garden had started to take shape, and even the neighbors began to take notice. They would stop by occasionally, peering over the old wooden fence that surrounded his property, offering comments ranging from polite curiosity to genuine admiration. "You're really turning that place around." One of the older neighbors remarked one afternoon, leaning on her cane as she watched Jeremy plant a new row of lavender. He smiled politely, grateful for the encouragement, though he mostly preferred to keep to himself. Jeremy wasn't antisocial, but after spending years in bustling cities and dealing with demanding clients, he cherished the peace and quiet his new home provided. But not all the neighbors were friendly. Jeremy had noticed one man in particular, Mitch Hansen, who lived 2 doors down, watching him with a different kind of interest. Mitch was the type of neighbor who always seemed to be up to something. He had a large house with an extended driveway that was constantly filled with trucks, construction equipment, and various vehicles. Jeremy didn't know much about him, but he had heard whispers from others in the neighborhood that Mitch was involved in some kind of construction business. Whenever their paths crossed, Mitch would give Jeremy a nod but never stop to talk, always seeming too busy or too preoccupied to engage in small talk. Despite the occasional odd glance or curious neighbor, Jeremy found solace in his garden. He loved waking up early in the morning to the sound of birds and the smell of fresh soil. It reminded him of why he had chosen this life, a life of calm, nature, and creativity. Every plant he nurtured felt like a personal achievement, every corner of the garden a reflection of his vision. The wooden fence that surrounded his property wasn't just a boundary, it was a symbol of the space he had worked so hard to create, a sanctuary from the outside world. One morning, after returning from a 3-day trip to oversee a client's project in another state, Jeremy immediately noticed something was off. As he turned into a street, a strange sight greeted him. The familiar neat lines of his garden were gone, replaced by deep tire marks cutting through the soil. Several large trucks and pieces of heavy construction equipment were parked haphazardly across his yard, and the wooden fence he had built by hand lay shattered in pieces on the ground. For a moment he thought he had turned onto the wrong street. It didn't seem possible that this destruction could be his peaceful haven, but as he got closer, the sinking feeling in his chest confirmed the truth: someone had trampled over his hard work without a second thought. Jeremy parked his car and stepped out, his heart pounding with a mix of disbelief and anger. As he surveyed the wreckage, he spotted a man standing near one of the trucks, smoking a cigar and barking orders at a few workers unloading supplies. It was Mitch Hansen. Jeremy's mind raced as he tried to make sense of what was happening. Why was Mitch's equipment on his property? Why had he destroyed the garden? "Hey," Jeremy called out, walking briskly toward Mitch, his voice carrying the weight of his frustration. Mitch turned slowly, exhaling a cloud of smoke before giving Jeremy a lazy smile, as if nothing out of the ordinary was happening. "Jeremy, buddy. Didn't expect you back so soon," Mitch said, his tone nonchalant, as though they were old friends casually catching up. Jeremy didn't bother with pleasantries. "What the hell is going on? Why are your trucks on my property? And why did you tear down my fence?" His voice was sharp, barely masking the anger bubbling beneath the surface. Mitch took another drag from his cigar, his expression remaining maddeningly calm. Relax, man. It's just temporary. I needed a place to park my trucks while we're doing some work on my house. Figured your yard had plenty of space, and you weren't around, so I didn't think it'd be a problem. Jeremy stared at him, stunned by the sheer audacity of the man's words. You didn't think it'd be a problem? You destroyed my garden and my fence. Do you have any idea how much work I put into this place? Mitch shrugged, flicking ash onto the ground. Look, it's not a big deal. I'll move everything in a few days, and you can put the fence back up. No harm done, right? No harm done, Jeremy repeated incredulously, his fists clenching at his sides. He felt a surge of anger rise in his chest, but he forced himself to stay composed. Losing his temper wouldn't solve anything. You can't just use someone's property like this. You had no right. Mitch's expression hardened slightly, the lazy smile fading. I don't see why you're making such a fuss. If you want, I'll throw in a few bucks to fix your fence. But don't expect me to move everything right now. We've got work to do, and I don't have time for this nonsense. Jeremy realized then that Mitch wasn't going to back down easily. This wasn't just a misunderstanding, it was a blatant show of disrespect. He knew he had to act fast before the situation spiraled further out of control. Taking a deep breath, he turned on his heel and walked back toward his house, ignoring Mitch's parting comment about learning to share. Inside, Jeremy paced the living room, his mind racing. He couldn't let this slide. Mitch had crossed a line, and it was clear he didn't care about the damage he had caused. Jeremy knew that if he didn't stand up for himself now, Mitch would continue to take advantage of him. This wasn't just about a garden or a fence, this was about boundaries, respect, and defending what was his. Grabbing his phone, Jeremy made a call to a lawyer he had worked with in the past. He knew this wasn't going to be easy, but he was ready for a fight. Jeremy sat in his living room, pacing back and forth, trying to suppress the wave of anger that threatened to consume him. His mind was racing, replaying the image of Mitch standing smugly by those trucks, acting as if he owned the place. The nerve of that man to not only destroy Jeremy's fence and garden, but to dismiss it all like it was nothing. As a landscape designer, Jeremy wasn't just upset because of the physical damage, it was the personal violation that stung the most. Every plant, every inch of that soil, every stone in that garden had been carefully chosen and placed by him. It was his sanctuary, and now it was gone trampled under the wheels of construction equipment and crushed by Mitch's indifference. The phone in Jeremy's hand felt cold and heavy as he stared at the screen. He needed legal advice. This wasn't something he could handle on his own. He didn't want to escalate the situation further, but Mitch had made it clear he wasn't interested in being reasonable. This wasn't a minor misunderstanding that could be resolved with a polite conversation. Mitch had crossed a line, and Jeremy wasn't about to let it go unchallenged. He scrolled through his contacts until he found the name he was looking for: Rebecca Hart, a no-nonsense attorney he had worked with a few years back on a contract dispute. Rebecca was sharp, thorough, and didn't take kindly to people who tried to push others around. If anyone could help him navigate this mess, it was her. Without hesitating, Jeremy pressed the call button. Jeremy, long time no hear. Rebecca's voice came through the line, calm and professional as always. What's going on? Hey, Rebecca, I wish I was calling under better circumstances, Jeremy began, struggling to keep the frustration out of his voice. I've got a situation with my neighbor, and I need your help. It's about property damage and unauthorized use of my land. It's bad. Rebecca listened attentively as Jeremy explained everything that had happened, how Mitch had torn down his fence, parked heavy machinery in his garden, and refused to move it. She didn't interrupt, but Jeremy could sense the growing tension on her end as the story unfolded. Okay, she said once he finished. This sounds serious. First things first, did you take any photos of the damage? Jeremy paused. He had been so caught up in the confrontation with Mitch that he hadn't thought to document the scene properly. No, not yet. I was too busy trying to get him to move the trucks, but he just brushed me off. Go back out there right now and take as many photos as you can, Rebecca instructed firmly. You get shots of the broken fence, the tire marks, the damaged plants, everything. Make sure the trucks and equipment are in the frame too, so it's clear they're on your property. If possible, get a video as well. You need to document everything before he tries to cover it up or move the equipment. Jeremy nodded, even though she couldn't see him. Got it. I'll do it now. Once you've done that, send me the pictures and we'll go from there. Depending on the extent of the damage, we might be looking at a civil suit for trespassing and destruction of property. Also, if he tries to pull any permits or claims, he has some sort of legal right to be on your land. I can help you contest that too, but for now, focus on getting evidence. Don't confront him again unless you absolutely have to. Let's build a solid case first. Thanks, Rebecca. I really appreciate this, Jeremy said, feeling a bit more grounded now that he had a plan. Anytime. And Jeremy, don't let him intimidate you. You have rights, and we're going to make sure they're upheld. After hanging up, Jeremy grabbed his phone and headed back outside. The scene looked even worse in the fading afternoon light. The once pristine garden was now a chaotic mess of dirt, debris, and machinery. The trucks were still parked haphazardly across his property, and the fence lay in splinters on the ground. Every step Jeremy took felt heavy with anger, but he forced himself to focus. He needed to stay calm and collected if he wanted to handle this properly. He began snapping photos from different angles, making sure to capture every detail. He took close-ups of the broken wooden planks from the fence, the deep tire ruts that scarred the soil, and the crushed plants that once formed neat, colorful rows. He took wide shots too, showing the entire yard and the construction equipment intruding on what should have been his private space. After taking nearly 100 photos, Jeremy switched to video mode and started recording. "This is Jeremy Steele," he said into the camera, keeping his voice steady. "Today is June 14th, and I'm documenting the damage caused by my neighbor, Mitch Hansen, who parked his trucks and heavy equipment on my property without permission. He tore down my fence and destroyed a significant portion of my garden." Jeremy panned the camera slowly, making sure to capture every angle of the damage. He ended the recording with a shot of the trucks and the faint figure of Mitch in the background, still standing near the construction equipment with that same smug expression. As Jeremy finished documenting the scene, he noticed something odd. A few yards away, near the back of his property, a group of workers had set up some kind of temporary shed. He hadn't noticed it before because it was partially hidden behind one of the trucks. Approaching cautiously, he saw that it was filled with construction supplies, cement bags, wooden beams, and large metal pipes. This wasn't just a quick parking job. Mitch was clearly planning to use Jeremy's property as a base for his construction project. Jeremy's frustration boiled over again, but he kept himself in check. He couldn't afford to lose his temper now. He needed to stay focused on gathering evidence and building his case. After taking more photos of the shed and the supplies, he sent everything to Rebecca, along with a brief message explaining what he had found. As he walked back toward his house, Jeremy noticed Mitch watching him from a distance, the smug smile replaced by something colder, more calculating. It was clear that Mitch had realized Jeremy wasn't going to let this go quietly. For a brief moment, they locked eyes, and in that silent exchange, Jeremy understood one thing: this wasn't just about convenience for Mitch. It was about power. Mitch thought he could push Jeremy around, use his property as he pleased, and get away with it because he had money and connections. But Mitch was wrong. Back inside, Jeremy's phone buzzed with a reply from Rebecca. "This looks good. I'm drafting a cease and desist letter now. Once I send it, he'll be legally obligated to stop all activity on your property until we resolve this. Also, I'm reaching out to a surveyor to confirm the property boundaries. If he tries to claim he has a right to be there, we'll be ready. Stay put and don't let him provoke you. We've got this." Jeremy took a deep breath, feeling a surge of determination. He wasn't sure how long this fight was going to last, but he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't going to back down. This was his home, his sanctuary, and he would do whatever it took to protect it. The following morning, Jeremy woke up to the sound of engines rumbling outside. He sprang out of bed and looked out the window, only to see that things had gone from bad to worse. More trucks had arrived during the night, along with a crew of workers who were now unloading additional supplies onto his property. Mitch stood at the center of the chaos, issuing orders as if the entire operation was happening on his own land. Jeremy's stomach churned with frustration, but he forced himself to remain calm. He had already sent the photos and video to Rebecca, and she was working on legal action. Still, seeing the growing mess outside made it impossible to sit idly by. Throwing on a jacket, Jeremy headed out to confront Mitch once again. He knew Rebecca had warned him not to engage unless absolutely necessary, but this was becoming unbearable. As he approached, Mitch noticed him and waved in an exaggerated, almost mocking manner. "Morning, Jeremy." "Beautiful day," Mitch said cheerfully, as if nothing was wrong. "Get your trucks off my property," Jeremy demanded, his voice low but firm. "You have no right to be here, and you know it. I already have a lawyer involved. You'll be getting a cease and desist letter soon." Mitch didn't even flinch. Instead, he took a leisurely drag from his cigar before responding. "Oh, I'm shaking, buddy. Look, I get it, you're upset. But let's be realistic here. This is temporary. A few more days and we'll be out of your hair. No harm, no foul. Why don't you just relax and let the grown-ups handle things?" Jeremy clenched his fists, resisting the urge to escalate things further. "This isn't a negotiation, Mitch. You've destroyed my property, and you're trespassing. Move your trucks now, or you'll be facing more than just a letter, you'll be dealing with a lawsuit." Mitch's expression darkened slightly, the smug grin fading for the first time. "You want to play it that way? Fine. Just remember, I've got friends in the right places. You think you can win this by whining to a lawyer? You'll be buried in paperwork before you even get a court date." Jeremy didn't respond. He turned on his heel and walked back toward his house, ignoring Mitch's parting words about how some people just don't know how to cooperate inside. He immediately called Rebecca to update her on the situation. "This guy's really pushing his luck," Rebecca said after listening to Jeremy's account. "Good news is, I've already sent the cease and desist letter. Legally, he's now required to stop all activity on your property. If he ignores it, we can escalate to an injunction, which means law enforcement can get involved." Jeremy sighed in relief. "Thanks, Rebecca. I don't think this guy's going to back down easily, though. He seems pretty sure he can get away with this." "That's exactly why we need to play this smart," Rebecca replied. "Keep documenting everything. Every truck, every worker, every piece of equipment they bring onto your land. If he keeps this up, he's only giving us more evidence to use against him." Jeremy thanked her again and hung up, feeling slightly more in control. He grabbed his phone and headed back outside to continue taking photos and videos of the ongoing activity. The workers barely acknowledged his presence, clearly under orders from Mitch not to engage. Jeremy could feel their eyes on him as he moved around the property, but he ignored them. His focus was on gathering as much evidence as possible. As he moved closer to the temporary shed the workers had set up, he noticed something unusual. Several large steel beams and heavy-duty construction equipment were stacked near the back of the property, far more than what would be needed for a simple home renovation. Jeremy's mind raced as he tried to piece together what Mitch was really up to. This didn't look like a routine construction project, it looked more like preparation for something much larger. But what? Before he could investigate further, he heard footsteps approaching. Turning around, he saw Mitch walking toward him, flanked by two men who looked more like security guards than construction workers. They wore dark clothes, and their expressions were cold and serious. "Can I help you with something?" Mitch asked, his voice dripping with mock politeness. "You seem awfully interested in what we're doing back here." "I'm documenting the damage you've caused," Jeremy replied evenly, "and I'll keep doing so until you move your equipment off my property." Mitch's grin returned, but it was colder now, more calculating. "You know, I tried to be nice about this. Gave you a chance to cooperate. But if you're going to make things difficult, don't be surprised if things get complicated." Jeremy didn't flinch. "You're already in violation of the law. Keep pushing, and you'll find out just how complicated things can get for you." For a moment, they stood in tense silence, the two men behind Mitch watching Jeremy closely. Then Mitch shrugged and turned away. "Suit yourself. But don't say I didn't warn you." As the group walked off, Jeremy felt a knot of unease settle in his stomach. This was no longer just about property damage. Mitch was clearly trying to intimidate him, and it was becoming increasingly obvious that this wasn't just a simple construction job. Whatever Mitch was planning, It involved far more than Jeremy had initially thought. Determined to stay ahead of the situation, Jeremy spent the rest of the day documenting everything he could. He photographed the steel beams, the construction equipment, and the temporary shed in detail, making sure to capture anything that might be relevant later. By the time evening fell, he had compiled a comprehensive record of the day's events, which he sent to Rebecca along with a detailed report. That night, Jeremy barely slept. Every creak of the house, every rustle of leaves outside made him jump. He couldn't shake the feeling that Mitch wasn't done trying to intimidate him. Around midnight, he got up and walked to the window, peering out into the darkness. The trucks and equipment were still there, looming like shadows in the moonlight. The sight only strengthened his resolve he wasn't going to let Mitch bully him into submission. The next morning, Jeremy received a call from Rebecca. "I've got good news and bad news," she said without preamble. "Good news is, the cease and desist letter is on record, and if Mitch ignores it, we can file for an injunction right away. Bad news is, he's already filed a counter-complaint." Jeremy frowned. "A counter-complaint? For what?" "He's claiming that part of the land you're accusing him of trespassing on actually belongs to him. He's trying to muddy the waters by creating a boundary dispute." Jeremy felt a surge of frustration. "That's ridiculous. I have the property deed, and it clearly shows the boundaries." "I know," Rebecca said. "But this is a classic stalling tactic. He's hoping to drag this out long enough that you either give up or run out of resources. Don't worry, I've already contacted a surveyor to verify the boundaries. Once we have that, we can shut down his argument before it gains any traction." Jeremy took a deep breath, trying to calm the anger that threatened to boil over. "Thanks, Rebecca. I'll keep gathering evidence on my end." "Good. And Jeremy? Stay alert. This guy's playing dirty, and he's not above trying to intimidate you. Don't let him get to you." "I won't," Jeremy promised. But as he hung up, he couldn't help but wonder just how far Mitch was willing to go. By the time the next morning rolled around, Jeremy was already on edge. The boundary dispute Mitch had thrown into the mix wasn't just annoying, it was dangerous. It was a clever, underhanded tactic designed to create delays and complicate matters further. Jeremy had seen these kinds of stalling tactics before when working on big landscape design contracts. In those cases, it was often a ploy used by wealthy clients or developers to exhaust their opponents into submission. But Jeremy wasn't someone who backed down easily, especially not when it came to something as personal as his own home and garden. Rebecca had been clear in her last call they needed definitive proof of the property boundaries, and fast. While she was working on getting an official surveyor to verify the lines, Jeremy decided to dig through his own records. He kept meticulous files on all the major purchases and projects he had undertaken since moving in, including the property deed and original site plans he had received when he bought the house. Somewhere in that stack of documents, he hoped to find something that could help them shut down Mitch's bogus claim before it gained any more traction. As he sifted through the papers, he found himself growing increasingly frustrated. This was supposed to be his peaceful retreat, his sanctuary away from the chaos of city life and demanding clients. Now, it had turned into a battleground. He knew that if Mitch succeeded in dragging this out, the damage to his garden would only get worse, and rebuilding everything would become even more difficult. After about an hour of searching, Jeremy found what he was looking for: a detailed map of the property, complete with marked boundary lines and measurements. It was dated and signed by the previous owner in the county assessor's office, leaving no doubt about its authenticity. He took a picture of the map and sent it to Rebecca with a note explaining where he had found it. A few minutes later, his phone buzzed with a reply. "This is perfect. I'll forward it to the surveyor, but keep it handy in case Mitch tries anything else." Feeling slightly more in control, Jeremy decided to step outside and check on the state of his garden. The sight that greeted him made his stomach turn. The trucks were still parked across his yard, but that wasn't the worst part. The workers had begun digging up sections of the soil near where his pond used to be, leaving large mounds of dirt and debris scattered across the once pristine landscape. The temporary shed they had set up was now surrounded by piles of construction materials, wooden planks, bags of cement, and steel beams stacked haphazardly. Jeremy's heart sank as he realized just how much work it would take to restore everything. Some of the rare plants he had cultivated were completely destroyed, crushed under the weight of the heavy machinery or uprooted by careless workers. He walked slowly through the wreckage, documenting everything with his phone. He knew it wouldn't bring back what he had lost, but every piece of evidence counted if they were going to make Mitch pay for the damage. As he neared the far end of the property, something caught his eye, a bright orange flag planted in the ground near the tree line. Frowning, Jeremy approached it and saw that there were more flags spaced out at regular intervals, forming a rough line that cut across his yard. It didn't take long for him to realize what they were markers for the supposed new boundary Mitch was claiming. Anger flared up inside him, but he forced himself to stay calm. He couldn't afford to lose his cool now. Instead, he took photos of the flags and noted their positions in relation to the actual boundary markers shown on his map. As he was finishing up, he heard footsteps approaching from behind. Turning around, he saw Mitch strolling toward him, hands in his pockets, and that ever-present smug smile plastered on his face. "Morning, Jeremy," Mitch said, his tone light and casual, as if they were old friends catching up over coffee. "I see you found the boundary flags. Figured it'd be helpful to mark things out clearly, given the confusion about where your property ends and mine begins." Jeremy stared at him, struggling to keep his composure. "There's no confusion, Mitch. The property lines are clearly defined in the deed, and you're trespassing. Those flags mean nothing." Mitch shrugged, unfazed by Jeremy's words. "Well, that's not what my lawyer says, but hey, I'm sure we'll get it all sorted out eventually. In the meantime, why don't you relax? No need to make this more difficult than it needs to be." Jeremy took a step closer, his eyes locked on Mitch's. "You can plant as many flags as you want. It won't change the fact that this is my property, and when this is over, you're going to pay for every bit of damage you've caused." For a brief moment, something flickered in Mitch's eyes, something cold and calculating. But just as quickly it was gone, replaced by that infuriating smirk. "We'll see," he said, turning on his heel and walking back toward the trucks. Jeremy watched him go, seething with frustration. He knew Mitch was trying to provoke him, to get under his skin and make him react irrationally. But Jeremy wasn't going to give him that satisfaction. Instead, he focused on what he could control, gathering more evidence and building a stronger case. Later that afternoon, Rebecca called with an update. "Good news, the surveyor's on board, and he can come out tomorrow to officially mark the boundaries. Once we have that, Mitch's boundary dispute will fall apart. Bad news is, Mitch's lawyer just filed a motion to delay the injunction hearing. They're trying to buy more time." Jeremy sighed. "Figures. So what's our next move?" "We push back," Rebecca said firmly. "I'm filing a counter motion to expedite the hearing based on the ongoing damage to your property. If we can prove that delaying the injunction would cause irreparable harm, the judge might agree to fast-track it. In the meantime, keep documenting everything. The more evidence we have, the better." "Got it," Jeremy said. "Thanks, Rebecca. I don't know what I'd do without you. Don't mention it." "Just hang in there, we're getting closer." The following day, the surveyor arrived as planned. Jeremy accompanied him around the property, watching as he carefully measured and marked the true boundary lines. As expected, the survey confirmed that Mitch's flags were well inside Jeremy's property, proving once and for all that his claim was baseless. Jeremy couldn't wait to see Mitch's reaction when he presented the results. As the surveyor finished up, Jeremy noticed a few of the workers watching them from a distance, whispering among themselves. He didn't like the way they were looking at him, like they knew something he didn't. Ignoring them, he focused on helping the surveyor finalize the report. By the end of the day, Jeremy had everything he needed: a certified survey report, clear photographic evidence of the damage, and a growing file of documentation detailing every violation Mitch had committed. He sent it all to Rebecca, who assured him that they now had more than enough to win the case. But as he stood in his garden that evening, looking out over the wreckage, Jeremy couldn't shake the feeling that Mitch wasn't done yet. This wasn't just about property or construction, it was about control. And Jeremy knew that as long as Mitch thought he could get away with it, he would keep pushing. What Mitch didn't realize, however, was that Jeremy wasn't someone who could be pushed around. He had fought hard to build this life for himself, and he wasn't about to let anyone take it away. The battle was far from over, but for the first time in days, Jeremy felt a flicker of hope. He had the law on his side, a strong case, and most importantly, the determination to see it through to the end. The next morning, Jeremy awoke to a strange silence outside. For the past several days, his mornings had been filled with the sounds of heavy machinery, workers shouting orders, and trucks rumbling across his garden. But today there was nothing. Cautiously, he got out of bed, dressed quickly, and went to the window. To his surprise, most of the trucks were gone, and only a couple of workers remained, packing up equipment near the temporary shed Mitch's crew had built on his property. At first, Jeremy felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe Mitch had finally come to his senses and decided to pull out. But as he stood there watching, something about the scene felt off. This wasn't the hurried departure of someone who had given up. It looked more like they were regrouping, waiting for the next move. Jeremy knew better than to let his guard down, especially with someone as cunning as Mitch. Deciding not to jump to conclusions, he grabbed his phone and went outside to document what was happening. The workers ignored him, acting as though he wasn't even there. Jeremy walked the perimeter of his property, taking more photos and noting the positions of the remaining equipment. As he approached the temporary shed, he noticed something odd. Several of the steel beams that had been stacked there earlier were now missing. Jeremy frowned, his mind racing. Mitch had brought in far more materials than were necessary for any normal construction job, and now those materials were being quietly removed. Was Mitch trying to hide something? He didn't have long to ponder the thought, because moments later a familiar voice called out behind him. "Well, look who's up bright and early." Mitch strolled toward him, his hands in his pockets and a smug expression plastered across his face, admiring the view. Jeremy turned to face him, keeping his expression neutral. "Where are the trucks going?" Finally giving up. Mitch chuckled, shaking his head. "Hardly. Just moving things around. Thought I'd make things a bit easier for you while we sort out this little misunderstanding." "There's no misunderstanding," Jeremy said coldly. "The surveyor already confirmed the property lines. You're trespassing, and you know it." Mitch's smile didn't waver. "Oh, I'm sure your fancy little report looks very convincing. But see, I've got my own surveyor coming in, and wouldn't you know it? He thinks the lines might look a little different when we're done. Boundary disputes can get messy, you know. These things take time to resolve." Jeremy's jaw tightened, but he forced himself to stay calm. Mitch was clearly trying to bait him into losing his temper. "You can drag this out as long as you want, Mitch. All you're doing is giving me more evidence to use against you. And when this is over, you'll be paying for every bit of damage you've caused." Mitch's eyes narrowed slightly, the smugness fading for a brief moment. "We'll see about that," he said, his tone colder now. "In the meantime, why don't you take it easy? You wouldn't want to stress yourself out over something that might not go your way." With that, he turned and walked back toward his house, leaving Jeremy standing in the middle of his wrecked garden, seething with frustration. He knew Mitch was bluffing, trying to buy time and wear him down. But Jeremy wasn't going to let that happen. Later that day, Rebecca called with an update. "So I've got some good news and some bad news," she said, sounding both determined and a little frustrated. "The good news is, the judge agreed to fast-track the hearing for the injunction. We're scheduled for next week." Jeremy breathed a sigh of relief. "That's great. What's the bad news?" "Mitch's lawyer filed a counter-motion claiming that you've been harassing his workers and interfering with their business operations. He's asking for a temporary restraining order to prevent you from coming within 50 feet of the construction site." Jeremy's eyes widened in disbelief. "Are you serious? He's the one trespassing on my property, and now he's trying to say I'm harassing him." "Unfortunately, this is a common tactic in disputes like this," Rebecca explained. "They're trying to paint you as the aggressor to muddy the waters and make it harder for the judge to rule in your favor. Don't worry, we'll fight it. But in the meantime, you need to be extra careful. Don't confront Mitch or his workers directly. Just keep documenting everything and let me handle the legal side." "Got it," Jeremy said, though the frustration in his voice was clear. "Thanks for the heads up." After hanging up, Jeremy took a moment to gather his thoughts. He couldn't believe how far Mitch was willing to go to avoid taking responsibility. This wasn't just a boundary dispute anymore. It was a calculated attempt to intimidate and exhaust him. But Jeremy wasn't about to back down. If Mitch wanted a fight, he was going to get one. Over the next few days, things remained tense but relatively quiet. Mitch's crew had scaled back their operations, but they hadn't left entirely. The remaining trucks and equipment sat idle on Jeremy's property, as if waiting for a signal to resume work. Jeremy continued documenting everything, keeping a careful record of every interaction and every new piece of damage. One evening, as the sun was setting, Jeremy noticed something strange. A black SUV had pulled up outside Mitch's house, and two men in suits got out. They spoke briefly with Mitch before heading toward the temporary shed on Jeremy's property. Jeremy watched from a distance, his suspicion growing. He couldn't hear what they were saying, but it was clear that something was going on. Grabbing his phone, he took a few discreet photos of the men in the SUV. He didn't recognize them, but their presence only added to the growing sense of unease. What were they doing here, and why was Mitch involving them? The next morning, Jeremy received another call from Rebecca. "We've got a problem," she said without preamble. "Mitch just filed for a preliminary permit to start emergency drainage work on your property. He's claiming that the soil erosion near the boundary line poses a safety risk and needs to be addressed immediately." Jeremy felt his pulse quicken. He's trying to use that as an excuse to keep his crew here. Exactly, Rebecca said. It's a sneaky move, but not entirely unexpected. The good news is we can challenge the permit since it's your property and he doesn't have the right to do any work without your consent. But it means more delays. Jeremy ran a hand through his hair, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on him. Mitch was clearly determined to drag this out as long as possible, using every legal loophole he could find. But Jeremy wasn't going to let him win. "Do whatever you need to do," he told Rebecca. "I'm not giving up." "I didn't think you would," she said with a hint of a smile in her voice. "Hang in there. We're going to get through this." As the call ended, Jeremy felt a renewed sense of determination. Mitch might have money, connections, and a team of lawyers, but Jeremy had something just as important, the truth, and he was going to use it to fight back, no matter how long it took. This wasn't just about winning a legal battle, it was about standing up for himself and protecting the life he had worked so hard to build. The day of the injunction hearing arrived faster than Jeremy expected, but he felt ready. Over the past week, Rebecca had been working tirelessly to prepare their case, gathering every piece of evidence. They had the property deed, the surveyor's official report, the photos and videos documenting the damage, and even statements from a few neighbors who had witnessed Mitch's trucks tearing through Jeremy's garden. Despite Mitch's attempts to delay and distract with counterclaims, Jeremy's case was solid. He just needed the court to see that. The courtroom was small but packed with tension. Jeremy sat beside Rebecca, feeling a mix of anxiety and determination. Across the room, Mitch sat with his lawyer, looking as smug as ever. He barely glanced in Jeremy's direction, instead leaning back in his chair, as if the whole thing was just a minor inconvenience. The judge entered, and everyone rose. After the formalities, Rebecca was the first to present their case. She spoke with precision and clarity, walking the court through each piece of evidence. She highlighted the clear boundary lines marked in the official survey, pointed out the blatant trespassing by Mitch's crew, and detailed the extensive damage caused to Jeremy's property. "Your Honor," Rebecca concluded, "Mr. Steele's property has been subjected to ongoing and unauthorized use by Mr. Hansen. Despite repeated requests to cease these activities, Mr. Hansen has continued to park heavy machinery on Mr. Steele's land, causing significant damage to his garden and fence. We ask for an immediate injunction to prevent any further trespassing or construction until this matter is fully resolved." The judge nodded, making notes as she spoke. Then it was Mitch's lawyer's turn. He stood up, adopting a calm, measured tone that was clearly meant to make their actions seem reasonable. He claimed that there had been a genuine misunderstanding about the property lines and that Mitch had only acted in the interest of safety by trying to perform drainage work on what he believed was his land. Jeremy couldn't help but clench his jaw as he listened to the lawyer spin the situation into something it wasn't. Mitch's team was trying to play the victim, portraying Jeremy as overly aggressive and unreasonable. It was infuriating, but Jeremy trusted Rebecca to handle it. When it was her turn to respond, Rebecca didn't miss a beat. "Your Honor, this so-called misunderstanding conveniently arose only after Mr. Steele began documenting the trespassing and damage. Furthermore, the emergency drainage work Mr. Hansen claims to have been performing was neither authorized by the city nor necessary, as confirmed by the official survey of the property. This isn't about safety, it's about Mr. Hansen trying to gain control of land that doesn't belong to him." Rebecca's words seemed to hit their mark. The judge leaned forward, scrutinizing the evidence laid out before her. After a few more back-and-forth arguments, she finally spoke. "I've reviewed the evidence presented by both parties, and it's clear that Mr. Steele has the rightful claim to this property. The boundary lines are well documented, and there is no legal basis for Mr. Hansen's actions. Therefore, I'm granting the injunction. Mr. Hansen, you are to remove all vehicles, equipment, and personnel from Mr. Steele's property immediately. Failure to comply will result in fines and potential further legal action." A wave of relief washed over Jeremy as the judge's decision sank in. Mitch, on the other hand, looked less smug now. His lawyer whispered something to him, but Mitch's expression remained tense. For the first time, it seemed like the man had realized he wasn't going to get away with this as easily as he had thought. As they left the courtroom, Rebecca turned to Jeremy with a satisfied smile. "We did it. He's out of moves for now." "Thank you," Jeremy said sincerely. "I couldn't have done this without you." "Don't thank me yet," Rebecca replied. "We've won the injunction, but the main case is still ahead. Mitch isn't the type to give up without a fight, so expect more trouble. But for now, he has no choice but to back off." That evening, back at home, Jeremy finally allowed himself to relax a little. The trucks were gone, and his garden, though still a wreck, was once again his. He knew there was still a long road ahead to rebuild what had been destroyed, but at least now he had the legal protection he needed to keep Mitch off his land. Just as he was settling in for the night, his phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. He opened it, and his stomach tightened as he read the words, "This isn't over, Steele. You'll regret this." Jeremy stared at the message for a long moment before closing his phone. He wasn't surprised. Mitch wasn't the kind of man to walk away quietly. But Jeremy also wasn't the kind of man to be intimidated. He had come too far, and he wasn't about to back down now. He forwarded the message to Rebecca, knowing she would document it as part of the ongoing case. Then he stepped outside onto his porch, looking out over the darkened yard. The air was cool and still, the stars just beginning to peek through the night sky. Despite everything, he felt a sense of calm. Mitch might still be plotting, but Jeremy was ready. He had the law on his side, a strong legal team backing him up, and the determination to see this through to the end. Whatever Mitch tried next, Jeremy knew he wouldn't be facing it alone. Over the next few days, things finally began to quiet down. Mitch's trucks were gone, the workers had disappeared, and the heavy machinery that had once scarred Jeremy's property was nowhere in sight. For the first time in weeks, his garden was free of intrusions. The temporary shed Mitch's crew had set up was dismantled, and the only remnants of their presence were the deep tire tracks and piles of broken debris scattered across the yard. Though the battle wasn't entirely over, Jeremy felt a sense of relief knowing that he had regained control of his land. The injunction was holding, and with Rebecca's help, he was confident the upcoming trial would solidify his victory. Still, the damage left behind was significant. Rare plants that had taken years to grow were gone, crushed beyond repair. The soil was churned up and contaminated with oil and debris, and the wooden fence he had painstakingly built lay in splinters. Every time he walked across the yard, Jeremy felt a pang of frustration, knowing how much time and effort it would take to restore everything to its former glory. But despite the enormity of the task ahead, he was determined to rebuild. This wasn't just a garden to him, it was a symbol of his hard work, his creativity, and his personal space. He wasn't going to let Mitch's arrogance take that away from him. Rebecca remained in close contact, keeping Jeremy updated on the legal proceedings. Mitch's lawyer had made a few half-hearted attempts to negotiate a settlement, offering a sum of money in exchange for Jeremy dropping the case. But Jeremy refused. It wasn't about the money. He wanted accountability, not just compensation. He wanted Mitch to understand that he couldn't bully or intimidate people into giving up what was rightfully theirs. "I admire your resolve," Rebecca said during one of their calls. "Most people would have taken the settlement by now just to be done with it. But I get it, this is personal." "It is," Jeremy agreed. "I'm not going to let him think he can get away with this. He needs to face the consequences." A week later, things took an unexpected turn. Rebecca informed Jeremy that Mitch had abruptly sold his house and moved out of the neighborhood. Apparently, the mounting legal pressure and the prospect of losing in court had finally forced Mitch's hand. Though he had tried to make Jeremy's life miserable, in the end he had been the one who couldn't handle the heat. Jeremy couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction when he heard the news. Mitch had thought he could walk all over him, but instead he had been forced to back down and leave. It wasn't the kind of victory Jeremy had initially envisioned. He had wanted to see Mitch held accountable in court, but it was a victory nonetheless. With Mitch gone, the neighborhood felt a little quieter, a little safer. Over the next few weeks, Jeremy focused on restoring his garden. He hired a team of professionals to help with the heavy lifting, removing debris, repairing the soil, and rebuilding the fence. Though it was painful to see how much had been lost, there was also something therapeutic about starting over. Little by little, the garden began to take shape again. New plants were brought in, and the damaged areas were gradually restored. One afternoon, as he was planting a new row of lavender, a few neighbors stopped by to offer their support. Some of them had been reluctant to get involved during the conflict with Mitch, but now that it was over, they were eager to lend a hand. One neighbor, an older woman named Clara, brought over a tray of homemade cookies and smiled warmly. "You really showed him, Jeremy," she said. "A lot of us didn't think it was possible, but you stood your ground. We're glad you didn't give up." "Thanks, Clara," Jeremy said, appreciating the gesture. "It wasn't easy, but I couldn't let him win. This place means too much to me." Clara nodded. "If you ever need help with anything, just let us know. The neighborhood's better off without people like him around." Jeremy smiled, feeling a sense of community he hadn't felt before. Though he had moved to the neighborhood seeking solitude, the experience had unexpectedly brought him closer to the people around him. By the time the garden was fully restored, summer was in full swing. Jeremy decided to host a small gathering for the neighbors who had supported him, as a way to thank them and mark the end of a difficult chapter. The air was filled with the scent of fresh flowers and the sound of laughter as people mingled and admired the newly restored garden. Standing in the middle of it all, Jeremy felt a deep sense of accomplishment. He had fought for his home, for his right to peace and privacy, and he had won. The garden, once a symbol of loss and destruction, had become a testament to resilience and perseverance. As the sun began to set, casting a warm golden glow over the yard, Jeremy took a moment to himself, breathing in the cool evening air. He knew there would always be challenges in life, but this experience had taught him something important. No matter how powerful or intimidating someone might seem, standing your ground and fighting for what's right was always worth it. With the garden restored and the conflict behind him, Jeremy finally felt at peace. This was his sanctuary, and he had earned it.